47 days of ceasefire, no airstrikes, no exchange of fire. And yet every intelligence desk from Langley to Tel Aviv is running the same quiet calculation right now. The headlines are telling you this is a standoff over 400 kilograms of enriched uranium. They are not wrong, but they are not seeing the full architecture either. This is not a story about a bomb, not about ideology, not about one rogue state defying the international order. This is a story about who controls the pricing mechanism for global energy for the next 2 decades, and how Washington designed a strategic trap that Tehran walked into without ever seeing the walls closing in. At minute 18 of this video, the 400 kilograms will stop looking like the main event. Because the real negotiation was never about what Iran keeps. It was always about what Iran can never rebuild once it gives that up. Stay with us. This is Strategic Lens Independent Open Source Intelligence Analysis. No alignments, no agendas. Only data, structure, and the strategic logic that the 24-hour news cycle consistently leaves on the cutting room floor. If you are watching this channel for the first time, subscribe now. Not because we update frequently, because when we do publish, the frameworks we build here will reshape how you read every headline that follows. The briefing continues. To understand why this negotiation is structurally different from every previous Iran nuclear deal, you need to understand the geography first. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. That is roughly the distance from one side of a major city to the other. Through that 33-kilometer corridor moves approximately 21% of the world's traded crude oil. The Energy Information Administration puts the daily flow at somewhere between 17 and 18 million barrels. There is no viable short-term alternative. The Abu Dhabi National Oil Company pipeline, running across the UAE, can handle approximately 3.5 million barrels per day, roughly 1/5 of what passes through Hormuz on a normal trading day. Every major Asian economy, Japan, South Korea, India, China, runs its industrial base through this single choke point. That is not a vulnerability. That is a structural dependency embedded into the global economic architecture over 5 decades. Now layer the nuclear dimension on top of that geography. The International Atomic Energy Agency has formally documented Iran enriching uranium to 60% purity. The threshold for weapons-grade material is 90%. The technical distance between 60 and 90% is real, but it is not a generational leap. It is a process question, not a physics barrier. Iran has not confirmed possession of an operational weapon. That distinction matters, and it will matter throughout this analysis. What we have then is a state sitting at the intersection of the world's most critical energy choke point and a nuclear threshold it crossed quietly, incrementally, and with full awareness of what crossing it would eventually force the other side to do. That is the baseline. Everything that follows is a consequence of it. Now, what does the IAEA actually confirm about Iran's nuclear capacity and what remains in the category of assessment rather than verified fact? Here is what the agency's own reporting establishes. Iran has been enriching uranium to 60% purity. That figure is documented. It is not contested. The stockpile in question, approximately 400 kilograms at that enrichment level, represents a material quantity that multiple independent nuclear analysts have flagged as strategically significant, though precise weapons yield calculations vary depending on warhead design assumptions. What the IAEA has not confirmed is an operational weaponization program. The distinction between possessing enriched material and possessing a deployable weapon involves several additional technical and engineering steps. That gap is meaningful. Collapsing it analytically leads to the kind of threat inflation that distorts policy responses. Here is what several analysts have assessed, and this should be framed as assessment rather than fact. The trajectory Iran has maintained since 2018, when the United States withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, has been a controlled, incremental escalation, each step technically reversible, each step raising the cost of any negotiated rollback. That pattern suggests a deliberate strategy of accumulating leverage, not an accelerated sprint toward an actual weapon. The difference between those two interpretations is the entire strategic question this video is built around. To understand why Operation Epic Fury happened in early 2026, you need to trace the structural breakdown that made it inevitable, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The 2015 nuclear agreement functioned as a managed equilibrium. Iran accepted enrichment limits. Sanctions were progressively lifted. International inspectors maintained access. The architecture was imperfect, but it held a specific tension in balance. In 2018, the United States withdrew unilaterally. From Tehran's strategic calculus, that withdrawal invalidated the core logic of the agreement that compliance produced tangible economic relief. Iran's response was not immediate. It was measured. Beginning in 2019, Iran began incrementally exceeding enrichment limits. Each step was announced. Each step was technically reversible. That pattern continued for nearly 7 years. By early 2026, Iran had reached what intelligence analysts classify as a threshold state. This term has a precise meaning. It does not mean Iran possesses a weapon. It means Iran has accumulated sufficient technical capacity and enriched material that the pathway to a weapon, if the political decision were made, could be measured in months rather than years. That assessment, shared across multiple Western intelligence services, according to open-source reporting, fundamentally changed the risk calculation for both Washington and Tel Aviv. When the cost of waiting exceeds the cost of acting, deterrence logic inverts. Operation Epic Fury, brokered into ceasefire by Pakistan on April 8, 2026, was not a spontaneous escalation. It was the terminal output of a 7-year compounding failure in strategic patience on all sides. The ceasefire is now 47 days old, and the question it deferred has not disappeared. It has simply been moved to a negotiating table. Here is where the conventional analysis breaks down. Every major news outlet covering this negotiation is asking the same question. Will Iran hand over the uranium? That question is not wrong, but it is the wrong level of analysis. It is asking about the object when the real negotiation is about the conditions attached to the object. Let us be precise about what the framework currently on the table actually demands. According to diplomatic reporting from multiple international wire services, the proposed agreement includes an inspections clause granting International Atomic Energy Agency personnel access to Iranian nuclear facilities on terms described as near unrestricted. The specific language matters here. Near unrestricted access is categorically different from the scheduled inspection protocols that govern the 2015 agreement. It implies the ability to arrive, examine, and document without the notification windows that previously gave Iran's program a degree of operational opacity. From Washington's perspective, this clause is non-negotiable precisely because the 2015 agreement's inspection architecture was its most significant structural weakness. Iran's incremental escalation between 2019 and 2026 was possible, in part because the verification mechanisms had predictable boundaries. Now, here is the paradigm shift. From Tehran's perspective, accepting near unrestricted inspections does not feel like a nuclear concession. It feels like a sovereignty concession. There is a meaningful difference between those two framings, and the negotiation is currently deadlocked inside that difference. Iran's leadership has spent decades constructing a domestic political narrative in which the nuclear program represents technological sovereignty, the right of an independent state to master the full fuel cycle without external permission. Accepting a verification regime that allows foreign inspectors to arrive at any time, examine any facility, and document any process effectively places Iran's most strategically sensitive infrastructure under a form of permanent external oversight. Several analysts have noted that this dynamic mirrors, in structural terms, the tension that collapsed previous agreements. The technical concession is manageable. The political optics of the technical concession are not. Then there is the timeline question. The United States has entered this negotiation demanding a 20-year enrichment moratorium. Iran's opening position was 5 years. The arithmetic midpoint is 12.5 years. But this is not a negotiation where the midpoint is the destination, because the two sides are not simply haggling over a number. They are haggling over which strategic era each number locks in. A 5-year moratorium expires in 2031 before the current restructuring of Middle Eastern energy alliances has fully consolidated. A 20-year moratorium expires in 2046, well past the projected timeline for regional solar and hydrogen infrastructure to meaningfully reduce dependence on Gulf hydrocarbons. That window is not incidental. Several analysts have assessed that the duration demand reflects not only non-proliferation objectives, but a calculated interest in stabilizing energy market assumptions during a period of significant transition away from fossil fuel dependency. Iran's negotiators understand this framing, which is why the number itself has become as contested as the uranium. So the deadlock is not, at its core, about 400 kilograms of enriched material sitting in a facility whose location remains unconfirmed by independent sources. The deadlock is about three interlocking questions that have no clean technical answer. Who verifies? On whose terms? And for how long? Everything else, the press statements, the social media signaling, the diplomatic back channels, is noise layered over those three questions. The uranium is the symptom. The verification architecture is the diagnosis. And the timeline is the prognosis. That is the paradigm shift. And once you see it at that level, the next 47 days look entirely different from how the headlines are currently framing them. Let us run the economic architecture of this blockade as a pure numbers exercise. The United States naval blockade on Iranian ports has been in effect since April 13, 2026. That is 42 days as of today. Before the current conflict cycle, Iran was exporting approximately 1.5 to 1.7 million barrels of crude oil per day, according to figures from the Energy Information Administration and OPEC secondary source reporting. At a market price of roughly $80 per barrel, a conservative estimate given current geopolitical risk premiums, Iran's daily export revenue was running somewhere between $120 million and $136 million. The blockade does not capture that revenue, it eliminates it. 42 days multiplied by $120 million per day produces a cumulative revenue gap of approximately $5 billion. That figure does not include frozen overseas assets, which independent financial analysts have estimated in the range of $6 to $10 billion, depending on jurisdictional access. It does not include the compounding effect of sanctions on Iran's ability to repatriate earnings from the limited export channels that remained open before April 13th. Now consider the asymmetry on the other side of this equation. The operational cost of maintaining a naval blockade for the United States carrier group fuel consumption, personnel deployment, logistical sustainment runs in the range of several $1 million per day based on publicly available Defense Department cost modeling for comparable sustained naval operations. The ratio is not close. Iran is absorbing economic damage at a rate approximately 40 times greater than the cost Washington is paying to maintain the pressure generating that damage. This is not an accident of geography. It is a deliberately engineered asymmetry. One additional variable demands attention here. The Wei bin Kach Mang Hoi Giao, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, operates a parallel economic structure inside Iran that includes construction, banking, and energy sector holdings estimated by various research institutions to represent somewhere between 20 and 30% of Iran's gross domestic product. That structure has its own cash flow requirements, its own payroll, its own operational dependencies. When national oil revenue compresses by the magnitude the blockade is currently producing, the question analysts are modeling is not whether the Iranian state budget comes under pressure. It is whether the Revolutionary Guard's parallel economy begins to feel that pressure independently, and what behavioral changes that produces at the institutional level. That is the mechanism the blockade is actually designed to activate, not the headline, the institutional stress fracture underneath it. Pull back from the economics for a moment and look at the strategic architecture of what Washington is actually requesting. The 20-year enrichment moratorium is the number that appears in every dispatch from the negotiating table. It is also the number most analysts are treating as an opening bid subject to standard diplomatic compression. The assumption embedded in that reading is that both sides are haggling toward a midpoint. That assumption deserves scrutiny. Here is what a 20-year moratorium actually locks in, expressed not in diplomatic language, but in energy market terms. The global energy transition is currently tracking toward a structural inflection point somewhere between 2035 and 2045. That is the window during which renewable energy capacity, solar, wind, green hydrogen infrastructure is projected by the International Energy Agency and multiple independent modeling institutions to reach the scale necessary to meaningfully compete with hydrocarbon dependency in industrial economies. A 20-year moratorium, signed in 2026, expires in 2046. That expiration date lands on the far side of that inflection point. What that means in practical terms is this. If Iran accepts the 20-year timeline, it surrenders its nuclear leverage during the precise historical window in which hydrocarbon revenues, the economic foundation of its regional influence, are also projected to face structural decline. Iran would be negotiating its next strategic position from a significantly weakened baseline on two simultaneous dimensions. Several analysts have assessed this as the core reason Tehran's resistance to the duration demand has been more intense than its resistance to the enrichment ceiling itself. The number is not just a number, it is a periodization of strategic disadvantage. Now examine the opposing logic with equal rigor. From Tehran's perspective, the Libya precedent is not a historical footnote. It is an active institutional memory. Muammar Gaddafi formally abandoned Libya's weapons of mass destruction program in 2003. He cooperated with Western verification teams. He reintegrated into international diplomatic frameworks. 8 years later, a NATO-supported intervention removed him from power. Iranian leadership has studied that sequence. The institutional conclusion it produced inside Tehran's strategic culture, according to multiple regional analysts cited in open-source academic literature, is that verified disarmament does not produce security guarantees, it produces vulnerability. This is not a defense of that conclusion. It is an explanation of why the conclusion is structurally coherent from inside the system that generated it. The result is a negotiating dynamic where both sides are simultaneously rational and irreconcilable. Washington cannot offer the security guarantee that would make disarmament feel safe to Tehran. Tehran cannot accept the verification terms that would make the agreement feel durable to Washington. 400 kilograms of uranium is sitting at the center of that irreconcilability. But the uranium did not create the problem. It is simply the most tangible expression of it. The pressure architecture being applied to Iran in this negotiation does not operate on a single channel. It operates on 3 simultaneous layers, each designed to stress a different institutional vulnerability. Understanding how those layers interact is more analytically useful than tracking any single data point in isolation. The first layer is economic, and we have already quantified it. $5 billion in cumulative blocked revenue over 42 days. Frozen assets in the range of $6 to $10 billion. A blockade cost asymmetry running approximately 40-1 in Washington's favor. The economic layer is the most visible and the most frequently reported. It is also, paradoxically, the slowest to produce behavioral change at the decision-making level, because authoritarian systems with parallel economic structures like the Revolutionary Guard's holdings can absorb surface-level fiscal pressure longer than democratic systems typically model for. The second layer is diplomatic, and its architecture is less obvious, but potentially more consequential. Pakistan's role as the ceasefire broker deserves careful attention here. Iran's traditional diplomatic insulation has historically relied on relationships with Russia and China, both permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, with veto capacity and economic stakes in Iranian stability. Routing the ceasefire negotiation through Islamabad rather than Moscow or Beijing is a structural choice, not a logistical convenience. Several analysts have assessed that this routing serves a specific function. It tests whether Iran can be engaged in a framework that does not automatically activate its great power relationships as a counterweight. If the negotiation succeeds through Pakistan, it establishes a precedent that Iran can be brought to agreement outside the protective architecture of Sino-Russian diplomatic cover. That precedent has implications well beyond this specific agreement. The third layer is informational, and it operates through deliberate, calibrated public signaling rather than classified channels. The public release of imagery showing United States military assets operating in the region posted through official and semi-official channels is not incidental communication. It is a precisely targeted message with a specific intended audience inside Tehran's decision-making structure. The Revolutionary Guard's institutional culture places significant weight on demonstrated capability and public credibility. Publicly displaying operational reach is designed to compress the psychological space in which Iranian hardliners can argue that American threats are performative rather than executable. This is what intelligence analysts sometimes describe as perception management at the strategic level. It does not require a single additional asset to be deployed. It requires only that the assets already present be made visible in a context that forces the opposing decision-making apparatus to factor them into its calculus. 3 layers: economic attrition, diplomatic isolation from traditional cover, informational compression of the hardliner argument space. None of these layers is designed to win alone. They are designed to compound. And the compounding effect is what the next 72 hours will either validate or stress test beyond its current structural limits. If the agreement reaches a signed framework, the immediate market signal will be a reduction in geopolitical risk premium currently embedded in crude oil pricing. Analysts at multiple energy research institutions have modeled that a credible Hormuz stabilization agreement could release somewhere between $5 and $8 per barrel from current prices in the near term, reflecting the unwinding of the conflict premium that has been priced into forward contracts since the escalation cycle began. The medium-term picture is more structurally significant. Iran's reintegration into international oil markets, even on a phased and conditioned basis, adds an estimated 1 to 1.5 million barrels per day of incremental supply capacity. That volume does not move prices catastrophically, but it materially changes the negotiating leverage of every other producer currently benefiting from constrained Iranian output. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have been among the indirect beneficiaries of Iranian export compression. A normalized Iran is a competitive Iran. That dynamic reshapes internal OPEC plus discussions in ways that extend well beyond the nuclear file. The inspections framework, if implemented as described, also creates a verification architecture precedent. The International Atomic Energy Agency, operating under near unrestricted access conditions in Iran, would represent the most intrusive monitoring regime applied to any threshold state in the agency's history. Several non-proliferation analysts have assessed that this precedent, if it holds, becomes the reference model for future negotiations with other states approaching similar technical thresholds. One agreement. Multiple structural consequences that extend decades beyond the document itself. Now run the alternative scenario with equal analytical discipline. If the negotiation collapses and the structural irreconcilabilities we identified in the previous section, make that outcome a genuine probability, not a rhetorical worst case. The consequences do not stay contained within the Iran file. The most immediate impact is maritime. The Strait of Hormuz, currently operating under ceasefire conditions, reverts to an active pressure environment. Marine insurance underwriters have already repriced Persian Gulf transit risks significantly since the escalation cycle began. A formal breakdown in negotiations would trigger another repricing event. Shipping operators running tanker routes through the Gulf would face cost increases that translate directly into delivered energy prices across Asian markets. Japan imports approximately 90% of its crude oil from the Middle East. South Korea's figure is comparable. India, now the world's 3rd largest oil importer, sources a significant share of its supply through Gulf routing. These economies do not have short-term alternatives at scale. They absorb the cost or they reduce consumption. Neither option is economically neutral. China's position deserves separate treatment. Beijing has been absorbing a substantial portion of Iranian crude exports throughout the sanctions period, often at discounted pricing that reflected Iran's limited market access. A negotiation collapse that returns Iran to full isolation paradoxically removes a source of discounted supply that Chinese refiners have structurally integrated into their procurement models. The collapse scenario does not simply maintain the status quo. It compounds existing energy market instability at a moment when multiple other supply variables are already in motion. Containment in this scenario is not a realistic operational assumption. There is a third variable in this analysis that the Iran-focused narrative is systematically underweighting. As of today, May 25, 2026, Taiwan's Coast Guard is in its second consecutive day of standoff with a Chinese Coast Guard vessel inside restricted waters near the Pratas Islands. Open-source tracking data indicates approximately 100 Chinese military vessels currently operating within the first island chain. This is not being reported as a crisis. It is being reported as a provocation. That framing distinction matters analytically. Several geopolitical researchers have noted a recurring pattern in Chinese strategic behavior. Periods of elevated activity around Taiwan's outer defensive perimeter tend to cluster during intervals when Washington's primary diplomatic and military attention is concentrated elsewhere. That correlation is documented. The causal interpretation remains a subject of genuine analytical debate and should not be stated as established fact. What can be stated is this. The Pratas Islands sit approximately 400 kilometers from Taiwan's main island. They are lightly garrisoned. Their defensive exposure during a period of distracted American strategic attention is a structural reality, regardless of intent. 2 theaters, 1 strategic attention budget. That constraint is not unique to this administration. It is the foundational tension of American grand strategy across every administration for the past 3 decades. The Iran negotiation does not create that tension. It simply makes it visible again. We began this analysis with a provocation that 400 kilograms of enriched uranium was not the main event. Having worked through the full architecture, that claim should now carry more analytical weight than it did at the opening. The economic layer established a 40-to-1 cost asymmetry running against Tehran for 42 consecutive days. The diplomatic layer revealed a brokerage structure deliberately designed to test whether Iran can be engaged outside its traditional great power protective framework. The informational layer identified a calibrated public signaling campaign targeting institutional psychology inside the Revolutionary Guard's decision-making apparatus. And the timeline question exposed a 20-year duration demand that is not simply a non-proliferation instrument. It is a periodization of strategic disadvantage, timed to overlap with the structural decline of hydrocarbon-based regional influence. None of that is visible if you are reading the headline about 400 kilograms. As of today, May 25, 2026, no framework has been signed. The economic pressure continues to compound. The Hormuz ceasefire holds, but it holds under visible strain. And 400 kilometers from Taiwan, a pattern of behavior that historically precedes escalation is currently in its second consecutive day. The story is not resolved. It is suspended at a point of maximum structural tension across multiple simultaneous theaters. 2 questions worth sitting with before the next briefing. If Iran ultimately surrenders the uranium but retains ambiguity on the inspections architecture, which side has actually won that negotiation, and by what metric would you measure it? And if China's current positioning around Taiwan's outer perimeter is correlated with Washington's Iran focus rather than coincidental to it, what does the sequencing of American strategic attention over the next 90 days actually look like on a map? Leave your analysis in the comments. The most rigorous responses will shape the framing of our next briefing. Subscribe if this level of structural analysis is what you came here for. The next video examines the Taiwan variable in full. This has been Strategic Lens. The briefing is complete.